Welcome to The Explainer. What if I told you that a regional struggle over in Southeast Asia would go on to completely rewrite the rules of modern warfare, media, and even global diplomacy? If you're the kind of person who wants to understand not just the what, but the why behind modern history, well, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're unpacking the deep, generative forces of a truly era-defining conflict, the Vietnam War. We aren't just going to sit here and list off dates and battles. Instead, we're going to break down how this conflict fundamentally reshaped the world. We'll look at the complex history and the incredibly lasting consequences that are still influencing our global society right now.
To really wrap our heads around this, we actually need to zoom out for a second. It's so tempting to just look at the Vietnam War as a localized skirmish, right? But as you'll see today, it represented a massive, critical juncture in the post-World War II geopolitical landscape. It was literally a catalyst for profound shifts in international diplomacy. It completely altered the social fabric of the nations doing the fighting, and even the ones just watching from thousands of miles away. It forced the entire globe to completely reevaluate military intervention.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for The Explainer today. First, we'll hit the roots of the conflict, colonialism and the Cold War. Then we'll look at the miscalculations and escalations. After that, we'll explore the living room war, and finally, we'll map out the deep societal scars and legacies left behind.
All right, part one, roots, colonialism and the Cold War. To truly understand this war, we have to untangle a really complex historical knot. This whole story is deeply woven with French colonial rule and the crazy rise of bipolar world powers right after World War II. Basically, we have two overlapping but fundamentally clashing motivations setting the stage here. Let's look at the Vietnamese perspective first. After nearly a century of pretty exploitative French colonial rule, we're talking extracting resources like rubber while totally suppressing indigenous culture, Vietnamese nationalism naturally surged. And here's a fascinating little detail. Nationalist leader Ho Chi Minh actually appealed to the United States for support at first, heavily referencing the American Declaration of Independence. But when those pleas were ignored, he skillfully adopted Marxism-Leninism. He didn't just see it as this abstract global ideology. For him, it was a highly disciplined, practical framework to achieve decolonization. Now, flip the coin to the United States. For the U.S., this wasn't primarily about local Vietnamese politics at all. It was a proxy war. The U.S. was driven by this massive post-World War II objective to contain communism and defend democratic capitalism across the globe. So you have this fierce national liberation struggle on one side, slamming directly into a superpower's global geopolitical strategy on the other.
So why did the U.S. double down and intervene so heavily? Well, it really comes down to the domino theory. Back in 1954, President Dwight D. Eisenhower popularized this falling domino principle. He sincerely believed that if Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia, places like Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, would just topple right behind it. This was a defining geopolitical paranoia of the era. Because of this one hypothesis, a regional independence movement was suddenly elevated to this high-stakes test of American global resolve. The U.S. government felt they literally could not afford to let that first domino fall.
Moving on to part two, miscalculations and escalation.
Let's look at how this powder keg actually ignited. The diplomatic failures really build on each other. Starting in 1954, after the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, the Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. They promised nationwide elections in 1956 to reunify the country, but guess what? Those elections never happened. The U.S. and South Vietnam blocked them, mainly because they knew the wildly popular Ho Chi Minh would win it all. 10 years later, in 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident drastically escalated the American role. Then you hit 1968, and the massive Tet Offensive completely disrupts the narrative. Finally, in 1973, the deeply flawed Paris Peace Accords are signed. Sure, it ended direct U.S. military involvement, but it left North Vietnamese troops right there in the south. It failed to secure any real, lasting peace for Vietnam.
Let's zoom in on that pivotal 1964 escalation for a second, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Before this, the U.S. was basically just in an advisory role, sending money, weapons, and military advisors. But what makes this moment so incredibly tragic is the intelligence miscalculation behind it. After one initial clash, a second alleged attack on U.S. naval vessels was reported. But here's the kicker. We now know that second attack likely never even happened. Yet, driven by hawkish advisors, this phantom attack became the ultimate justification for escalation. Congress passed the resolution, gave the president broad authority to use military force without a formal declaration of war, and the dial was instantly turned up to 10. The U.S. transitioned straight into direct combat, pouring hundreds of thousands of troops into Southeast Asia.
Which brings us to part three, the living room war. You see,
This conflict just happened to coincide with a massive explosion in media technology. It created a totally unprecedented intersection between war and public visibility. Vietnam was the very first major conflict extensively covered by television. Imagine being an American citizen back in the 1960s. For the first time in history, you're seeing unfiltered, highly graphic images of combat broadcast straight into your living room on the nightly news. You could literally hear the chaotic sound of jungle gunfire while eating dinner. Because of this, the government could no longer curate the narrative. The public saw the true, bleeding cost of the war with their own eyes, and it sparked a totally new era of intense public scrutiny.
And nothing illustrates this quite like the 1968 Tet Offensive. Militarily speaking, this massive surprise attack by communist forces was actually a staggering defeat for them. They suffered incredibly heavy casualties and failed to hold their targets, but diplomatically, psychologically, it was a massive watershed victory. The graphic media coverage of intense urban fighting, including the temporary occupation of the U.S. Embassy compound itself, absolutely shocked the world. When legendary anchor Walter Cronkite looked into the camera and declared the war was mired in stalemate, President Lyndon B. Johnson reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Those raw TV images completely shattered the official narrative that victory was just around the corner, causing domestic support to completely plummet.
Finally, Part 4. Societal Scars and Legacies. The fallout from this went way, way beyond the battlefield. In the U.S., returning veterans often faced a public that was hostile or just indifferent, leading to alienation and a totally misunderstood crisis of PTSD. Over in Vietnam, the devastation is almost impossible to fully quantify. Beyond the millions of lives lost, the U.S. military's use of chemical defoliants, specifically Agent Orange, left devastating multi-generational health impacts. We're talking severe birth defects and cancers affecting families to this day. Politically, when the Pentagon Papers leaked, it proved the government had been lying about the war for years, leading to a severe erosion of public trust. And globally, the sheer human cost fueled a massive unified anti-war movement that saw millions taking to the streets worldwide.
It's a really fascinating dichotomy when you contrast the domestic and global fallout. Inside the U.S., the war fractured the national consensus. It literally tore at the fabric of society, creating these massive generational divides between older folks who trusted the state and the youth being drafted to fight. It cemented a lingering skepticism toward leadership. But internationally, the war actually acted as a huge unifying force for activism. It sparked protests from Paris to Tokyo, challenging the whole idea of superpower hegemony. It forced the world to step back and reassess the true morality and human cost of those rigid Cold War battles. So to wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to really think about. The Vietnam War undeniably forced us all to reevaluate the limits of military power. It deeply influenced how we view state sovereignty and human rights today. So looking at the geopolitical conflicts playing out in our world right now, how does the shadow of Vietnam continue to shape international law? And what is our collective threshold for military intervention today? It's a huge question, and it proves just how deeply history continues to inform our present. Thanks so much for joining me to explore this today. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.